Hello, everyone. Today we're going to be continuing looking at the rise and power of the papacy in the age of Innocent III. This is the high point of papal power. We're also going to see the transformations taking place in Europe in the leading and development of the rise of heresies, as well as the beginnings of mendicant orders or revivalist preachers also beginning to appear. So let's go ahead and get started. So we're going to look at Pope Innocent III as one of the more pivotal figures in the papacy. It is considered the most powerful pope in history, born Lothario Conti from an old aristocratic Roman family. He was a well-educated legal scholar, being trained at universities in Rome, Bologna. If we remember talking about in our last lecture, the University of Bologna was the center of legal scholarship and thought, and as well as taught at the University of Paris, which was the center of theological thought in the universities at the time. He was appointed cardinal and then succeeded to the office of pope in 1198. As pope, he began to use the title Vicar of Christ. Now, previous popes used the title Vicar of Peter. Vicar of Christ was not a relatively new term. Most kings used it as a form of sacred kingship, designating the right and authority of both their subjects for their physical needs as well as their spiritual needs. And so Pope Innocent III began to use this title primarily to demonstrate that he was in himself an absolute monarch, the absolute monarch over all of Europe that deals with both the physical needs of Christendom as well as the spiritual needs. He sought and expanded papal control in Rome and Italy, and began to use the papacy as a means of controlling the beliefs and conduct of people across Christian Europe. And as Pope, one of the things he did was he began to roll back the powers of the Western monarchies, primarily getting into the weakening of the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire, remember, was a collection of different Germanic states, from Denmark all the way down to northern Italy. He began to roll back the Holy Roman Empire, removing some of their claims over northern Italy, and he began involved in the election of the Holy Roman Empire. So there was a debate about who would succeed into the position of emperor. It was Pope Innocent III with France backing their candidate against most of the German electors, and England with their candidate. And ultimately, Pope Innocent was able to get his candidate, Frederick II, installed as emperor in 1214. But he also, at the same time, too, was able to have the electors, the different Germanic states, gain more power and authority, therefore weakening and disuniting the Holy Roman Empire even further. He also checked the powers of England and France. He got into a heated debate and argument with the King of England over the appointment of the Archbishop of Canterbury, ultimately opposing each other's candidates. Finally, he ordered an interdict against England. An interdict is where the church ceases to perform all of its functions. So, mass, prayer for the dead, all those functions would cease. Baptisms would cease in England. And so in 1208, England was put under an interdict. And then for 4 years, England refused to cave in on these demands. The King of England, John, refused to give in. And ultimately, he was excommunicated in 1212. And this finally forced King John's hands. And so King John surrendered to Pope Innocent III, and gave over the entire kingdom of England as a fiefdom to Innocent III, as well as having to pay an annual tax to Pope Innocent. So it was a huge win for Pope Innocent and the papacy. He also put France under an interdict, and this one was involved because of King Philip's marriages. He was married to a princess from Denmark named Ingeborg, and he didn't like her, didn't want anything to do with her, tried to have her removed and put into a monastery. And ultimately, he was placed under an interdict to force to take back his wife. And so this was another massive win for the papacy in gaining control and expanding their power and authority. So what Pope Innocent III began to do was to began to centralize the church government. He began to reorganize it and expand its power and authority, and expand the bureaucracy of the papacy as well. So he centralized and placed it under the control of the papacy and the cardinals, as well as creating expanding the authority and power of the papal legates. Remember, in the early medieval period, from around 500, 800 AD, the papacy had prestige, but not a whole lot of power. Bishops could act in some way independent of the Bishop of Rome, not to a great extent, but really could manage their own affairs without really a lot of direct influence. Now the papacy is having a much greater direct influence. This came out of the Cluniac reforms and the Gregorian reforms a century earlier. And so with these papal legates, now you had them invested with all their power to handle affairs, pretty much enforcing the policy of the papacy in the different dioceses across Europe. He also imposed the first general income tax on all clergy. So now the clergy not only collecting tithes had to send a tax to Rome as well. He also organized the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215. Most historians consider this as the birth of the Roman Catholic Church. There is a debate between its either or. So you could say that the Fourth Lateran Council is when the Roman Catholic Church began. Some argue it's the Council of Trent. You could say it was born in the Fourth Lateran Council, but matured at the Council of Trent 300 years later. So it's some debate, but ultimately the Fourth Lateran Council is significant because it's the papacy trying to reorder and cement strict control on the beliefs of Christians. So ultimately organizing and systematizing Christian thought, and then also going out and mandating it and making it part of the Christian world at this point. Some of the things that came out, for example, is that Christians, must perform at least one confession a year, as well as partaking in communion at least once a year. And so what we see is a transition from the penitential piety of the Carolinginian and post-Carolinginian age around 800 AD, where penance was a part. Not to say that penance ceases, but what happens is that it's much more focused on the sacramental system that we see with the rise of we see elements of it in the church, but it's systematized under Peter Lombard's Four Book of Sentences, where you have those 7 sacraments, and they're kind of codified into the Fourth Lateran Council. And so with that sacramental piety, now a key component of the church, of the papacy, now you have the papal legates going out to make sure that this is being enforced across the church. And then when we see with the mendicant orders, those revivalist preachers, they will play a role, as well as having to spread that sacramental piety to bring in the church and the laity to this process and making it a rhythm of their daily life. Also, we see right now with the transformation in Europe. So now that Europe, in a sense, has had increased stability. After the Carolinginian age, there was instability, internal and external, invasions by the Vikings, disintegration of the Carolinginian Empire. Now that there's some level of increased stability, it doesn't mean there wasn't conflict between different monarchies or wars or feudal conflicts and such, but there is a level of stability and economic growth that is happening across Europe. With that, there also began to be increase in anti-Semitic attitudes. And we'll see also not only an increase in anti-Semitic attitudes, but also a rise in heresy begin to be taking place as well. We'll address those issues later on. But the Fourth Lateran Council deals, in a sense, with the Jewish people, forcing them to wear distinct clothing. They had to live in separate communities, in organized communities. They were restricted from certain employments and forced into employments of other areas. And there's a sense of growing hostility towards the Jews. We see that, for example, in England in 1209, all Jews were expelled from the country. And then 100 years later, France expelled them again in 1306. And then in 1391, Spain expels them as well. And then and so there in Germany too, there are evidences of mass persecutions taking place, for example, like in Strasbourg around the middle of the 14th century. they marched the Jews, 2,000 Jews, out into the cemetery, and those who refused to convert are burned at the stake. So there is mass expulsions, massacres in various countries, and dealings with the relationships to Jew. And really, the reason why is because, in a sense, paranoid fantasy, in that the Jews were kidnapping Christian children and drinking their blood in the sense of a mock communion, and, mocking the Christian communion. There's also a sense of hatred towards the Jews because of their role as money lenders, and Christians owing debt to these Jews. So there was a sense of a bad relationship. And as the rise of towns, the rise of cities begin to appear, and economic expansion, economic growth begins to happen, the Jews began to, those who were involved in money lending and those who were successful, began to gain some aspects of wealth, and therefore it began to it acquire them a level of notoriety in the local Christian community as, well, why are they gaining wealth? I'm a Christian, they're not. Why are they attaining this greater wealth and having this greater prosperity? And here I am, a poor Christian townsman, and I'm in debt. So there was conflict there as well. And the treatment of the Jews they were poorly treated in this medieval period, and will continue onward throughout the centuries. So like I mentioned, there is an economic transformation that happens prior to the Black Plague, the bubonic plague, the Black Death, that happens in the end of the 14th century. This economic growth happened as feudal manners began to, like I said, as the instability began to roll back and people began to clear land, towns and villages began to spring up. Trade routes began to open, in part thanks to the Crusades and the contact east, the expansion of the merchant class. So we have here a growth and a wealth growth taking place. But with that, with these growth of town and cities and trade, the old social system, the feudal structure is still there, but it begins to break down and weaken, especially in those towns and cities. So you don't have, in a sense, of a peasant farmer trusting that the Lord, the local manor, will protect them and provide for them and care for them and defend them. Now they're kind of left to their own devices in these communities. So there's a communal change that's taking place as well. And you have different classes gaining greater prominence. So instead of being a knight or nobleman and having massive wealth, you could be a merchant and gain even greater wealth and greater power and influence. And so it began to kind of upend the social balance that was in place in that early and high middle point. And so now now as we enter into the late Middle Ages, it begins to change as well. So there's a loss of security found in the community. And this in turn will lead to the rise of dissenting groups. Because now, with the rise of universities too, that's happening with this economic growth. So not only is there just an economic growth, there's an intellectual growth that's happening simultaneously with these transformations across Europe. People are gaining access to greater access to and rise of literacy and reading and book material. And so now there's a sense of dissent that's happening to what they see around them. And so in opposition to what they find in scripture or find in interactions with different communities. And so people began to stand up and speak out. We see the church transform in response to this, as instead of being a persecuted church into in a sense, a persecuting church. And now that the church is the cemented figure across Europe, it begins to develop and formulate plans to address these either dissenting groups or heretical groups that appear as well. So one of the dissenting groups was known as the Waldenesians. They were founded by Peter Waldo, who was a wealthy merchant from 1173 to 1205. He heard the preaching of Christ and giving up your wealth, speaking to the young rich ruler. And so taking it as a personal call for himself, sells all he has to devote himself to living a life of poverty and preaching. At this time, it becomes very popular. It's known as the Vita Apostolica, the way of the apostles. And so people begin to be drawn to imitating the way the apostles acted in the New Testament, in the book of Acts, especially selling all they had and living a life of preaching and sharing the gospel and teaching scripture. Initially, what's also amazing too is Pierre Waldo gains a Bible in the vernacular. He asks a priest to translate the Latin Vulgate into the vernacular French for him, and so that way he can preach from it. So Peter Waldo gains a great following for his teachings. Initially, his group was permitted by the Third Lateran Council in 1179, but they weren't allowed to preach. There was a ban on them for preaching, but Peter Waldo said, no, we're going to keep on preaching, and he was excommunicated in 1184. So some quick questions. Why did these revivalist preachers appear? Why did these dissenting groups begin to appear? And there's different factors that play a role in this. One is the growth in the penitential piety and the sacramental piety that we'll see later on with the Fourth Lateran Council. There is, as the church continues to expand, remember the rise of Paris churches with Charlemagne, and that expansion of the missionary movement into Central and Eastern Europe. There is a growth of people being able to attend and having a devotion to the church and hearing, at least in hearing and interacting with some aspects of scripture. There is also, like I said, the rise of crusades. There's also the rise of pilgrimages and relic tours. So it has that fervent and emotional need that's tied in with it as well. We see the rise of literacy with the appearance of universities. Not just clergymen can read, but now those who have money and means can send their children, aristocrats or not, merchant classes as well, to universities to receive some formalized education to come back. So now you have, in a sense, young readers who can participate in reading the Latin Vulgate, reading texts, and therefore having access to scripture. So all of these, in a sense, play a role. Now, the papacy does oppose some of these dissenting groups, but not others. And the reason why, it's really the groups that are anti-clerical. During the Gregorian reforms under Pope Gregory, remember we talked about Hildebrand or Pope Gregory, there was dealing with corruption, simony, marriage, corrupt leaders within the church, corrupt clergymen. But now that the church has kind of, in a sense, handled those issues, it begins to shift focus. Instead of using the laity and using secular authority to root out corruption, there's not going to be a focus on that. Instead of focusing on maintaining the order and stability in the church and maintaining the teaching of what was happening in the church. And so, for example, in the Fourth Lateran Council, one of the things that came out of it was that the sacraments convey aspects of grace. So you take the sacraments to continuously receive some form of grace, but receiving the grace from the sacraments is not based on the moral standing of the clergyman. The clergyman can be the most corrupt clergyman on the planet, but as long as the sacraments themselves will receive that divinity and therefore offer that grace to the individual, it's not the person themselves as we convey it over. And so, as what you'll see with these different groups, the dissenting groups that had problems with corruption in the church will oppose. But the other groups that are preachers, and like we'll see with the Franciscans and Dominicans, who do not have a problem being under the authority of the church and a problem being under the authority of certain clergymen, the church will support. The papacy will support. So there is a divide in attitude of how the church deals with these different groups. So, for example, the Waldenesians, they believe the Bible is supreme authority against the authority of the papacy. The Waldenesians oppose transubstantiation. They oppose purgatory. They oppose the prayer for the dead and indulgences. They do believe in the veneration of Mary. But the Waldenesians are important. They do appear and rise in northern Italy and southern France. They do make their home really in northern Italy. We'll see that they'll come under severe persecution, but they will continue to survive and thrive and exist in a sense to this day. So they are considered in some ways, because of their focus on scripture's supreme authority over the church, as well as rejection of some of the many sacraments. They do kind of gravitate into the Protestant body. And so they are considered the oldest Protestant body to this day. You have then another dissenting group, in this sense, the Cathars, or the Cathars, depending on how you want to pronounce it. They were a Gnostic group with ties to the Bogomil. So one of the previous Byzantine lectures I talked about, there were Gnostic groups in the East, or Manichaeans in the East, these dualists really, in the East. So there are the Paulicians and the Bogomils. And so there's a debate exactly on the origins of the Cathars, whether or not they were even real or not. One group of scholarship said, yes, there's ties to the Bogomils. We see the evidence of Gnostic groups in Northern Europe, in Northern France around 1140. They migrate into Southern France, Northern Italy around the 1200s. They became centered around certain towns, for example, the town of Albi in France. And so they're known as the Albigensians. These French Cathars are. Cathars means the pure ones, Greek for the pure ones. So that's one aspect of scholarship. There's another aspect that says the information that we have from them comes primarily from the Inquisition. We really have no writings of the Cathars themselves, of what they actually believed. But all the writings we do have about them come from confessions made from persecutions by the inquisitors against the Cathars. So most of their thoughts could have been constructed from either false confessions or confessions under duress by individuals, as well as, paranoid fantasies of the inquisitors. So one of the big arguments is that how, at the height of the papal power and authority, that this alternative church that has its own bishops, church buildings, how could it gain so much ground and authority right on the doorstep of the papacy itself? So there is some debate in the scholarship behind what these groups actually believe. But regardless, it's still important because of what they believe, nonetheless, in reaction of the church to the supposed heresy that was appearing. The Cathar belief, for example, just like any typical Gnostic, believes that the physical world is evil and is created by the devil. In a sense, everything, matter, time, being, space, all that evil, wicked, made by Satan. Satan is, in the Gnostic belief, is always elevated to some superior power. Satan in the Cathar tradition is equal with God, as eternal and all powerful in a sense, and that the soul is really an angelic spirit. It's trapped in an evil body, and so the goal is to release the soul from the body. And the greatest sin that one can commit is sex. That is the ultimate sin in the Cathar beliefs. They also believe that Christ did not, because physical matter is evil, Christ did not have a physical body and did not really die on the cross. And salvation is not meant by Christ living and dying and having that atonement. Salvation is only done through the sense of enlightenment. Once again, it's another aspect of Gnostic belief that you have to, it's all about your mindset, the power of positivity in a sense. It is that by attaining that level of enlightenment, you too can achieve and move beyond into the next and freeing your angelic soul and being. Another aspect too is that the Cathars oppose the papacy and views the papacy as the Antichrist, as most of these dissenting groups will do, in some ways do. They did reject baptism. They rejected Holy Communion. Their group, they had a Gnostic kind of like group structure, where you had kind of the initiates. Those were the believers, and then you were elevated into the perfect. The only way you could be elevated into the perfect is you had to renounce all marriage and property. You had to abstain from sex and meat, as they were symbols of the body. And so you had to also go through this initiation process with swearing an oath and having the Gospel of John on top of your head, and promising to follow the orders and such. But the Cathars will suffer a horrendous persecution in the sense of the Albigensian Crusades. Like I talked about in my Crusade lecture, there are many different types of crusades. There was crusades against Islam. There's crusades against pagans in Eastern Europe. There were Reconquista in Spain, which is technically a type of crusade. This is actually a crusade against, in a sense, non-Christians within Europe. So this is a directly internal crusade, what's happening in Europe. Originally, Pope Innocent and the papacy tried to deal with the Cathars by sending individuals to preach among them, to try to convert them back into the fold of the church. It wasn't working. And so ultimately they declared a crusade against the Cathars in 1209. This was immensely supported by the French king and the nobility of northern France. Southern France was viewed almost in a sense as a separate realm. We kind of like want to think of France as one, in a sense, like today, a big united country, but don't forget it's divided up into different feudal lands and territories. And southern France had a different mindset in ways versus the northern France. And so this was an opportunity to gain land, wealth, glory, etc., as well as indulgences, the spiritual ramifications of participating in the crusade. The French king always looking to expand his political power and authority over French nobles, participated willingly in the crusades. What's interesting is that some people came to the defense of the Cathars. For example, the king of Aragon, I believe, in Spain, helped protect and tried to prevent the mass destructions that were taking place in southern France. So not everybody lined up really to help destroy the Cathars, but the campaign lasted for a long time, 20 years. In one account, a city of 20,000 people were completely wiped out and massacred. It was a brutal affair in southern France. It was absolutely destructive. Another dissenting group, the Petrobrusians, were founded by Peter de Bruce in 1105. Again, a popular priest turned revival preacher was burned at the stake in 1126. It made once again opposition to many of the elements of sacramental piety and what was being promoted from the was promoting ideas in a sense that were promoted within the church before it was codified in the Lateran Council. For example, denied infant baptism, opposed that the church buildings were holy in of themselves, and the use of altars within the church. Rejected the use of sign of the cross, the transubstantiation, the idea of transubstantiation, opposed the mass. And so his group especially was targeted for persecutions by the Inquisition later on and by the papal legates and church communities. And they were dispersed into other dissenting groups like the Waldenesians, the Cathars, and the Begins and the Beghards that we'll look at later. So their group was dispersed outward as well. Joachim of Fior was a Cistercian monk and founded a monastery at Fior in 1192. Now he's an important individual because in a way so these revival groups began to appear. One in a sense of seeing the economic instability that was taking place around them, but also there's in a sense an eschatological background to it as well. And Joachim Fior, in a sense, amplifies it in one of his most important works, the mystical writings of the Everlasting Gospel, in that it divides the history of the world into three ages. The Old Testament is the age of God the Father. The New Testament is the age of God the Son. And then the new age that will come in 1260 is the age of the Holy Spirit. And that's when the true church appears, which will be led by the true monastic order in a sense. And so it'll be an age of great revival and transformation. It'll bring in the new age of the kingdom. And so this was influential on different dissenting groups because people were, in a sense, were looking for in those who ran with and understood the everlasting gospel were inclined to believe that which of these revivalist groups that began to appear, whether Petrobrusians or the Waldenesians, the Cathars, or the Franciscans, and so on and so forth, whether these different groups that appear was the supposed beginning of that new age. So there was an eschatological undercurrent that was happening within these dissenting movements as well. Another aspect of expanding papal power. So besides addressing and opposing these dissenting groups, the means in which that Pope Innocent III began to deal with these heretical movements was the formation of an Inquisition. Inquisition deal with the old kind of land law versus accusato, where you have the accuser, kind of like in a court case, you're tried before the accused. Your accuser's there to accuse you of the crime you committed. The Inquisition is done actually in the sense of the church. So it centralizes the investigation under the church. That it's not conducted by it's not in a sense conducted or ran, the Inquisition's not ran by the local bishop, it's ran by the papacy, who appoints individuals as inquisitors to deal with these heretical groups, and they answer to the Pope themselves. There's special legates. Eventually, the Dominicans will be the ones who really administer the Inquisition, and they kind of gain a lot of negative notoriety because of that. So if one is accused of being a heretic, you're brought before a church official. You're not brought before your accuser. The church official has to prove that you're a heretic. You're already assumed guilty of being a heretic, and the church official must find evidence and proof of your heresy. And it's impossible to prove one's innocence. And so the church gave them every available means to prove that you were a heretic through torture, solitary confinement, lengthy imprisonment. One man was imprisoned for at least 19 years for heresy, and to force a confession from you. What's interesting is that initial confessions were admissible, but then they began to add that you had to be a confession to be admissible, you had to not only confess of your heresy, but those within your circle of who were heretics. So in a sense, it created this global network, and that's what I was talking about with the Cathars. There's some elements of it possibly not being a real wide, in a sense, not worldwide, but a real massive heretical movement. It may have been some dualists and some Gnostic believers within different towns and cities, and may have had some elements of a small organization, but maybe not as large as it was once thought. But like I said, that's scholars and historians debate that. But the inquisitors themselves were using their manuals and using their writings to really investigate. And they kept meticulous records because they wanted to catch people in perjury of making those claims. And so we have long records of books upon books of inquisitor files of what actions were done, what people's responses were, how they were tortured. And this Inquisition forced many dissenting groups to go underground. Supposedly from I believe from 1231 to 1331, anywhere from 8,000 to 40,000 people went through the Inquisition. So there's still some debate. It's not the Spanish Inquisition that most people remember later on. There are different periods of Inquisitions. And this Inquisition was mostly localized in around southern France and northern Italy. But later on, this will be used. And this is really the first time that the church had this kind of power to arrest and imprison, torture individuals based on claims of heresy, as well as then lead them up to having been executed by the state. So really, this is, like I said, the transformation of a persecuted church into a persecuting church in this time period of absolute power of the papacy. Pope Innocent III, like I mentioned in my Crusade lectures, was involved within the Fourth Crusade. The Fourth Crusade was dealing to try to once again conquer Egypt and reclaim Jerusalem. And this crusade went sideways pretty quickly in the Fourth Crusade and ended up taking Constantinople. And so Pope Innocent III tried to end the schism between the Western Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. But after the success of the Fourth Crusade, kind of having to deal with the cards that were dealt with for him, he appointed a Western Catholic Patriarch of Constantinople. He began to try to enforce the Western Catholic traditions on the Eastern Orthodox people, to no success whatsoever. It was a short-term affair, really lasting only for a couple decades, until finally Western control would come to an end in 1261, when the Byzantines were able to reconquer Constantinople. But like I said in the Crusades lecture, this is really the death knell for the Byzantine Empire in a sense, because they'll never really recover from this. The rise of the Ottoman Turks will also play a role in bringing the fall of the Byzantine Empire, which we'll look at in our next lecture. So we looked at the dissenting groups that were opposed by the papacy. Now we're going to look at revivalist preachers and revivalist movements that began to appear that was supported by the papacy. One is the Franciscans, founded by Francis of Assisi in 1209. He was son of a local noble. Francis was involved in some military affairs and such, and then he heard and hearing the gospel, felt called to preach and live a life of simplicity, live a life of faith, and gained a real following from his lifestyle, living a very simple lifestyle, living by begging, pretty much, like I said, following the Vita Apostolica, in the sense of following the practice of apostles by living by almsgiving, not in the sense of being forced into poverty, but willfully following that lifestyle. And he gained many followers for it, and so had in 1209 founded the organization and wrote rules for his followers that emphasize that poverty and simplicity of faith versus the intellectual clergymen, those who began to appear out of universities. He gained papal recognition from Pope Innocent III in 1210, and Pope Innocent III actually had a dream that for the Franciscans, and so agreed to gain them recognition. They had to, once again, though, respect clerical authority, though they answered to the papacy in a sense. They were independent of their local bishops. Over time, though, they began to lose simplicity and began to become a proper monastic order. They began to gain, like any order organization, it didn't last long in a sense because you need places to stay, you need buildings and some sort of structure. And so these Franciscans were gifted buildings to act as monasteries, and act as education center or operation centers for the Franciscans. And so from these spiritual friends, and so there was a transformation of this order into a real, what we would call a mendicant order, in a sense because they live by giving, and monastic order. Francis would really just be disappointed, in a sense, disgusted what happened with the order that he's built, and he would leave the order in 1220. And Cardinal Ugolino would be appointed to replace him and lead the Franciscans. One of the lasting legacies of Francis was that he promoted the idea of individual conscience, that you don't have to follow a priest or bishop by what they say. If they say something that's wrong, countermanding to the church or scripture, you have the individual conscience you have that freedom of individual conscience to not have to follow them or listen to them. He is the first one really noted for the stigmata. Before he died, 2 years before he died, having bleeding from his hands and from his side and from his feet. It becomes extremely popular as a sign of a saint. And so we see it primarily in the Roman Catholic Church. We don't see a stigmata appear in any Protestant churches or Eastern Orthodox churches. And, there's been hundreds and hundreds of people that claim to have the stigmata in the Roman Catholic Church. Francis would die in 1226, and playing that pivotal role in founding the Franciscans. Now, the Franciscans will continue to drift from those original rules. And in fact, we see the rise of many schoolmen come out of the Franciscans. You have Bonaventura, you have Alexander of Hales, you have John de Scotus. So you have many different, and William of Ockham, you have many different Franciscans that began to appear as, the university intellectual movement. They still, in some ways, try to live the rules, but the rules began to weaken over time. Nicholas of Lyra is an important individual, especially for the Reformation. He was a theology teacher in Paris in 1309. He supported the grammatic historical interpretation of Scripture over the allegorical interpretation of Scripture, and we see that really on the rise too. Thomas Aquinas argued that in the same manner, of literal interpretation over allegorical and dealing with doctrines of the church. He promoted his first Bible commentary, and it was the first Bible commentary that was printed off the printing press. Nicholas of Lyra tried to master Hebrew as well to gain a better understanding, and especially for his work on his commentary in the Old Testament as well. So his work would go through like 100 editions from 1471 to like 1600. It was really popular as a Bible commentary early on. And the famous quote is that if Nicholas Lyra didn't play his lyre, then Martin Luther would never have danced. So there was an important individual that connected the Protestant Reformation to these early Franciscans. The Franciscan group will go into a division, and I kind of mentioned this in the last lecture. There was a group of Franciscans who wanted to return back to the original rules of Francis of Assisi and oppose what they saw as the rise of wealth and property shaping the Franciscan order. These were the spiritual Franciscans versus what was called the conventional Franciscans. the spiritual Franciscans would actually have to go underground as a dissenting group because they would be declared as heretical by, I believe, Pope John the 22nd. And this division lasts until 1517, when Pope Leo X allowed the two Franciscan orders to operate separately. So they are operated as observants and conventuals. So there is two aspects of the Franciscan order. Then you had the Dominicans, founded by Dominic Guzman, young man ordained at the age of 25, and he was sent by the papacy to help preach in the gospel and scriptures against the Waldenesians and Albigensians and oppose their influence. He realized that the most effective way to communicate to these individuals, instead of living the ostentatious life of the clergy bishops, of the parish priests that had means and wealth, was living a simple and pure lifestyle. And living the lifestyle, in a sense, would help convey the message more so. And he focused on that. The focus instead was on preaching and teaching. And so they would, but also living, in a sense, another level of life of poverty, like the Franciscans, and begging for food and sustenance. And this whole process would gain followers and transform into a movement again. And he would have to write his own rules in 1214 for this order. And this becomes the Dominicans, or also known as the Order of Preachers, or the Order of Friar Preachers. It also gains papal approval in 1217. So you have now two groups. You have the Franciscans operating and the Dominicans operating, in a sense, playing an important role to help expand, ideas that were codified in the Lateran Council, but also reinforce that besides just having the papal legates, the clergies, and the bishops, now you have revivalist preachers interacting with the laity, the congregation of the people of Europe, and bringing them more in line into the thought of the Catholic Church, in a sense. They're distinguished by their black attire, and really were known for their involvement in teaching and working in university systems, as well as preaching and giving the right to preach anywhere and everywhere. Their most famous influential figure is Thomas Aquinas. That's their most famous theologian. They were known for also they're educating women. They were Dominican nuns. They had a very intense rivalry with the Franciscans, primarily on two different things. One is theological differences. For example, the Immaculate Conception. Franciscans supported it. Dominicans did not. There was also the Dominicans, like I said, staffed the Inquisition. And so many people of Europe just trusted the Dominicans for that exact reason, for that negative mark that they have in working for the Inquisitions and rooting out heresy. But like I said, these preaching orders worked as kind of like the forward guard in helping to create this unified Christendom across Western Europe, and creating this unified religious landscape. There are other mendicant orders that also began to appear, not as numerous as the Franciscan Dominicans. You have the Carmelites. They're, in a sense, actually a little older. They were founded in around Mount Carmel, 1154. They had to flee with the fall of Acre and Jerusalem and such, to fall of those Crusader states. They were kind of reconstituted into a mendicant order in 1247, and they're known for wearing a white cloak. So, on the picture on the left, they have them in brown, but they wear a white cloak over it to identify themselves as Carmelites. And then you have the Augustinians, who were originally hermits that transformed into a mendicant order. They followed Augustine's rule. Augustine developed his own rule for monastic order as well early on in the 4th, 5th century. So those individuals chose to follow the Augustinian order. And we know this becomes famous in a sense because Martin Luther goes into an Augustinian order as well, and comes out and play an important role in shaping his theological thought. Now, the mendicant friars, their mission was much different than the early monastic movements we saw, because and this makes sense, because when the church, in a sense, went through that transformative change with the emperor Constantine becoming a Christian and elevating the church and allowing the church pretty much the freedom of worship, we saw individuals oppose the corruption they saw began to appear in the church and turn away from the world and live outside the world, live separate from society. Now, with this transformative change happening again, with this economic change and the rise of the papacy, we see these monastic orders, instead of seeking to escape from the world, to go out into the world and convert society over to Christianity as well. So instead of withdrawing from society at all, going back into it. And the goal was to always preach and win disciples in Europe and an extent outside of Europe into other lands in Asia and Africa. They primarily begged for food. They were not bound to any specific monastery, so they were, in a sense, traveling friars. They depending on your sources and who you look at, there's always some individuals who look negatively on the friars too. You read the Canterbury's Tale, Geoffrey Chaucer kind of attacks the friars. He has a character, the friar, who offers prayer for dead for some money or for some gifts. So in a sense, friars may have abused their position as well of gaining wealth and gifts and food and money to offer prayers and to offer services to the local community. So there was some negative notoriety. And especially as they were exempt from the local bishop's authority, the local bishop couldn't do anything to really control these friars. So they answered to their order, and the order answered to the papacy. There were other groups and orders as well in other communities. The Beginnings and the Beghards are unique in that they're a spiritual community, but it was for lay people. They wanted to devote themselves, in a sense, to a very strict spiritual lifestyle. And it's a very popular movement. In a sense that we'll see that kind of grows out of this is Thomas à Kempis's Imitation of Christ later on, from kind of like a descendant from these movements. The Beginnings were a female-only sisterhood, and it spread primarily in Netherlands, in those early weaving communities that type the weaving from the wool coming from England, the wool trade happening from England into the Netherlands. And so they opposed the wealth and prominence they saw in towns and cities around Europe and wanted to live that simple spiritual lifestyle and caring for the sick, helping the poor, focusing on reading scripture, and living like the apostles from the book of Acts. And the Beghards were the male counterparts to the Beginnings and their female-only sisterhoods. Now, the group was suspected of heresy by the church because they didn't tie themselves to any authority. Once again, even if you weren't promoting any anti-clerical attitudes, if you weren't under clerical authority, you could be suspected of heresy. And so many claims were made against them. Pope Clement V condemned them, and then that was reversed by Pope John the 22nd. And so ultimately, long story short, that these groups, the Beginnings and the Beghards, had to join monastic orders. And many dissenting, actually, like the Waldensians, the Cathars, and others, kind of in a sense escaped into these groups. And so there was a fear that you had these other heretical groups coming in and spreading heretical ideas. And so these groups joined monastic orders for protection by the 1400s, and so to escape persecution from the church. There was also growth and continuation of the missionary movement. Early, like we talked about during the Gregorian reforms and the Carolinginian period, monasteries and monks played a role as the forward movement of expanding Christianity to Germanic lands in Central and Eastern Europe. Now, beyond Europe into Asia and Africa, there is now still a focus of spreading the gospel as well. The Franciscans and Dominicans play an important role in that regards. You had Dominican Raymond of Pinafort sharing the gospel, evangelizing Muslims in Spain during the Reconquista. You had Dominic William of Tripoli. He actually convinced the Pope to not declare a crusade, and instead shifting focus on trying to convert Muslims peacefully. Then you had the Franciscan Conrad of Ascoli go to Libya and supposedly baptized 6,000 Libyans into the church as well. So there were efforts being made to help convert Muslims in Africa and Spain. Then you also, in Asia, the Pope sent John of Plano Carpini to the court of the Mongol Khan in Karakorum in Mongolia, or Ulaanbaatar. My apologies, Ulaanbaatar. Maybe it was Karakorum. But anyway, what was interesting was when he received by the great Khan Guyuk, Guyuk listened to John of Plano Carpini, said, "Thank you, but no thanks. I don't want to become a Christian. But what I want you to do is send a letter back demanding that every Catholic ruler, the Pope, France, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, all of them must now submit to me as the universal ruler of the world." He did allow John, the Mongols, like I said, were tolerant of all faiths in the sense in that they allowed different religions to exist within their empire. They really didn't care to promote one over the other. But they would allow them to exist as long as you submitted to their authority and their rule. Now, there was, like I said, because of the Mongol Empire, in a sense, the continuation of the Silk Road, merchants traveling back and forth, Marco Polo, the famous story right there. So there is a growth in that commerce, but along those roads, along the Silk Road and along those trade routes, we see the goal of expanding Christianity and sharing the gospel, and in a sense, a missions movement by the Western Catholic tradition. We looked at it a little bit in the Eastern Orthodox as well with Russia. Kublai Khan sent a request for 100 Christian scholars in 1269, and so the Pope only sent one, John of Montecorvino, who arrived, unfortunately, after Kublai Khan's death. And when his son, his successor, was on the throne, permitted John to continue to preach and set up an order, in a sense, in the East. And so the Pope placed upon John of Montecorvino as the Catholic Archbishop of Peking, or modern-day Beijing, in 1294. And it would exist. It won't thrive necessarily. It does grow in some sense. It has difficulty growing in China. But ultimately, because the Mongols are not Chinese and they're opposed by the local Chinese people, their hold on China is tenable at best, and the Chinese people go into an uprising and form their own dynasty, the Ming Dynasty, and throw out the Mongols. And so there's a fear of any foreigners by the Chinese, so they kick out the Mongols, and they begin to kick out all Westerners as well. And so the church goes into collapse and is completely persecuted out of existence in China for the next couple hundred years until the end of the Age of Exploration. So besides the closing of the missionary, what causes the close of the missionary movement as well, and kind of wraps up into right when we get into the final phases of the medieval period, is the Black Death. It supposedly occurred in one of the Mongols' campaigns in the Crimea. Mongols were known not to enjoy lengthy sieges, and so by any means necessary to end a siege. And so they would use dead bodies to spread disease into a city, forcing them to surrender faster. And so one of these diseases in the Crimea, in one of the port cities, was the bubonic plague, which infected the fleas, which infected the rats. Rats go on ships, and these boats were traveling all around the Mediterranean. And so ultimately, the bubonic plague, as these rats came ashore and the fleas jumped from fleas to humans, the virus spread among the population. And so the death was anywhere from a third to a half of the population. So, for example, we do have records. So when England was conquered by William the Conqueror at the end of like 1000 AD, he recorded the population about 1 million. By about when it was 1347, the population in England was roughly about 3.7 million people. By the 1400, there was only 2 million people left. So a million and a half people died within a short span of time. And so there was massive death toll across Europe. No one's really exactly sure. So that's why historians kind of give estimates of 75 to 200 million people total. And this will also have impactful ramifications, as we'll see in our final lecture in the Catholic Church in Crisis, because this impacts the church as well, its religious thoughts, as well as economic continuing that social instability that happens with economic transformation. The missionary movement goes kind of into a decline and remains stagnant until after the Reformation. So I want to thank you for joining us for our lecture today on looking at the continuation of the history of the church through the Middle Ages.